Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to the third and final day of the 35th International Churchill Conference. To introduce our first speaker of the morning, we have the beautiful Catherine Katz.
Good morning. It's lovely to see you all bright and early on this very special Armistice Day. It's only fitting that on this centenary of the Armistice that we turn our thoughts to the European continent, where so much blood was shed in the wake of, among other causes, rising nationalist sentiments. Nationalist impulses are once again on the rise, both in the United States and Europe. Nationalism does not necessarily have to be a negative force driving hostility. However, as New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote just this week, if you don't offer people a positive, uplifting nationalism, they will grab the nasty one. History and recent events have shown us that. With that in mind, we welcome our next speaker, who offers an alternative perspective, one in which a pan-European identity goes hand in hand with national identity. A member of, as he describes, the Erasmus Generation, he looks to Europe as a place where continental similarities and common goals outweigh national differences. He believes that recognizing those similarities and common objectives that unite Europeans offers the best path to peace and international cooperation. Felix Klos joins us today from Amsterdam. Educated in the international spirit, he is a graduate of Middlebury and Lincoln College, Oxford. For the past several years, he has worked as a speechwriter and spokesman for the leader of the D66 party in the Netherlands, and he's currently running as a candidate for the European Parliament, to which he hopes to be elected next May. You, however, know him best as the author of two very timely books, Churchill and Europe, The Untold Story of Churchill's European Project, which was dubbed a must-read in advance of the British referendum, and Churchill's Last Stand, The Struggle to Unite Europe. And as I hear, he plays a mean jazz piano as well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the talented and very charming Felix Klos.
Thank you for those unnecessarily kind words of introduction. I wish to speak to you today about the tragedy of Europe. It is not often that words spoken by a newly ousted, elderly conservative politician on a holiday in Switzerland are worth paying any attention to. But these words were listened to intently. They were listened to all over Europe and far beyond. They were listened to in disbelief, amazement, some understandable skepticism, but overall with reawakening hope. Then again, this elderly politician was none other than Winston Churchill. The year was 1946, and these simple words, dictated by the future winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature on board a train of neutral Switzerland, combined to make the first sentence of his momentous speech at the University of Zurich. Working with the darkest colors of his lush palette of language, he painted an unsparing picture of Europe's despair in just a few simple strokes, saying, "Over wide areas, a vast quivering mass of tormented, hungry, careworn and bewildered human beings gape at the ruins of their cities and homes and scan the dark horizons for the approach of some new peril, tyranny, or terror." Then, using his most vibrant colors, he put a small but tantalizingly bright spot of light on those dark horizons. He said, "Yet all the while, there is a remedy which, if it were generally and spontaneously adopted by the great majority of people in many lands, would, as by a miracle, transform the whole scene." What is this sovereign remedy? It is to recreate the European fabric and to provide it with a structure under which it can dwell in peace, safety, and freedom. We must build a kind of United States of Europe. Now, at this point, I could tell you that this speech changed the world, like a catchy airport book title. But I won't, because it didn't. Because speeches alone, as Churchill never tired of reminding his audiences, never do. What the speech did do, though, however, was set in motion an unbroken chain of events that ultimately brought Europe together. And that autumn day in Zurich, Churchill took charge of a movement of peoples. His speech electrified idealists all over Europe who started organizing themselves in pressure groups, demanding governmental action on European unity. The general public, of course, overwhelmingly supported Churchill's campaign for Europe, and governments, they took notice too, even on this side of the Atlantic. General Marshall laid out his plans for reconstruction, citing Churchill's Europeanism as his source of inspiration. And delighted by the response, Churchill started molding all of those national and pan-European activist groups into a single force. He created, with the indispensable help from his son-in-law, Duncan Sandys, a team of rivals, competing with one another only for the greatest devotion to the common cause. Not long after, Churchill proposed an audacious scheme. He intended to bypass national governments and bring all the vital forces of Europe together in a conference at The Hague called the Congress of Europe. Justice Kennedy just last night referred to its proceedings and its revolutionary outcomes in his very moving remarks last night. The goal was to rise above platitudes and generalities. To the lofty ideals of peace and unity, Churchill brought the gritty realism of the hardened wartime leader. And the European movement, which grew out of this Congress, became defined by that most famous of Churchillian phrases: action this day. Churchill did everything in his power to guarantee the success of the conference. He solicited funds, ensured all party support, except, of course, from the communists, arranged visas for the Germans, prepared the headline speech, and handpicked the propaganda symbol for the Congress, the large red E, which still graces the flag of the European movement. And on the eve of the conference, wrote the New Yorker, star attraction Winston Churchill descended from the skies like a beaming cherub. In his wake followed, among others, future British Prime Minister Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan, a rising star in West German politics called Konrad Adenauer, and a young Frenchman by the name of François Mitterrand. A generation of Europeans convened to do what Churchill did best: cast their minds to the future. Leaders of thought and action from all the free countries of Europe combined to let out a lion's roar of united European resolve. And on Friday, 7 May 1948, Churchill entered the Knights Hall for his opening address. He began by expressing his confident hope that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe would one day be able to join those of the West. Martin Gilbert argues that it would have moved Churchill greatly to see those countries join the European Union at the start of this century. And in that, as in so much else, I think he is right. Churchill welcomed the German delegation, which the then still vindictive Dutch government, and I'm not proud of this as a Dutchman, only allowed into the country after Churchill applied the full pressure of his political weight. And then he turned to the heart of his message. Economic integration and joint military defense, Churchill said, must inevitably be accompanied step by step with a parallel policy of closer political unity. He reasoned, it is said with truth that this involves some sacrifice or merger of national sovereignty. But it is also possible, and not less agreeable, to regard it as the gradual assumption by all the nations concerned of that larger sovereignty, which can alone protect their diverse and distinctive customs. A larger sovereignty, a European sovereignty, a Europe that protects, l'Europe qui protège. Like good wine, these ideas have ripened. 70 years after they were first bottled, they are finally ready for consumption. And one particularly skillful sommelier has already removed the cork from a bottle found in the cellar of the French presidential Élysée Palace. Now it's just a matter of finding friends to drink with. And I'm no connoisseur, but I've heard that some German wines are now among the best in the world. Churchill would know more. Now, Churchill did not start talking about European sovereignty out of nowhere. His speech at The Hague was the culmination of a lifetime of engagement with the idea of linking the nations of Europe, though only after the shock of the Second World and its geopolitical implications, which of course included the Soviet threat, but also the demise of empire, would that idea come to include Churchill's own country, Britain. not as part, of course, as an exclusive federation, but as a leader of a looser union of states, which could amplify British power in the world, and which, who knew, could grow into something more solidly integrated in the future. And it's this vagueness that, of course, we're still dealing with in the Brexit debate today. The idea of European unification first came to Churchill's attention in 1904, when a German army officer sent him a 7-page paper titled "The United States of Europe." It argued rather arrogantly, from a German, for the economic and political integration of Britain and France. And 2 decades later, the European ideal came truly into fashion, when the Austrian-Japanese philosopher Count Coudenhoven-Kalergi wrote about it in his best-selling book, Pan-Europa. Coudenhoven turned the great French statesman Aristide Briand, who proposed in a speech broadcast around the world to establish a European federal union. Churchill, unfortunately, had been unable to listen to the broadcast because he was on a lucrative speaking tour here. But, having returned to Britain, he listened to the speech, and he prepared a written response. In an article in the Saturday Evening Post, Churchill declared himself entirely in agreement with the plans. Churchill's Britain, importantly, would be squarely outside of that European federation. In 1930, Churchill could scarcely envisage British membership of a federated Europe. As the British Empire was still the most powerful entity in global politics, with by far the widest geographical reach, Churchill wrote of Britain and its empire, "We have our own dream and our own task. We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not comprised. We are interested and associated, but not absorbed." Here were the seeds of Churchill's famous 3 circles of British foreign policy theory. The first circle was, of course, the British Empire and Commonwealth, which spanned Britain's colonial possessions and the family of nations that independently adhered to the British Crown. Those were then still the white dominions: Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And the second was the fraternal bond with the United States of America. The third was the collection of European states to which Britain belonged geographically, historically, and culturally. In all of those circles, Churchill thought, Britain ought to play a role. She should stand at the intersection of all 3 circles, guiding America in the ways of old world diplomacy, remaining at the head of the Empire and Commonwealth, and shepherding a flock of European continental states. After Churchill came out in support of a united Europe, many more thinkers joined the European cause, especially in Britain. By 1940, a British advocacy group called the Federal Union had more than 10,000 members and editorial support from The Times and The Guardian. Their main message: let's unite Europe after we win the war. But at this point in history, Churchill moved center stage. On 10 May 1940, he assumed the office of Prime Minister for the first time, responding to the call to protect his nation, Europe, and Western civilization as a whole. Walking with destiny, which I'm sure Andrew has a lot more to say about. And plenty is known about the heroics of Churchill's first year in office. Many of you will undoubtedly be much more knowledgeable about Britain's finest hour than I am. But much less is known about the extent to which Churchill, while actually trying to win the war, was busy thinking about the future of Europe. In June 1940, a month into his tenure as wartime Prime Minister, Churchill proposed indissoluble union to France. A single Franco-British superstate, he called it, with common citizenship and joint government. The idea for the Anglo-French Union, if it were not for the fatal hostility from a majority of French ministers, would have laid the foundations for the sort of European Union that Churchill came to envisage after the war. And after 1940, Churchill returned over and over again to the idea of creating a common instrument of European government. He would call it the Council of Europe. By the autumn of 1942, events were finally moving in the direction of the Allied forces, and it gave the Prime Minister the breathing space to further develop his thoughts. In October of that year, Churchill sent a secret minute to his Foreign Secretary, that same Anthony Eden, outlining his thinking. Eden, frankly, was astonished, offended even, because while he was working on a system of cooperation with Soviet Russia, Churchill wrote this: "Hard as it is to say now, I trust that the European family may act unitedly as one under a Council of Europe. I look forward to a United States of Europe in which the barriers between the nations will be greatly minimized and unrestricted travel will be possible. I hope to see the economy of Europe studied as a whole. Of course, we shall have to work with the Americans in many ways and in the greatest ways. But Europe is our prime care." Now, I'm personally, frankly, still astonished, though definitely not offended, that historians have largely neglected Churchill's passionate, sustained, and ultimately successful campaign for European unity. Because while his campaign generally takes up no more than a perfunctory paragraph in any biography, I believe it to be one of his most consequential feats. It was, as President Eisenhower said, and I think he knew a thing or two about these things, the crowning achievement of a career crowned by achievement. Never was this better illustrated than during the Conference of The Hague in 1948. The most powerful achievement of that Congress was that it meant that the unity of European countries was no longer just a dream, but a problem of the day, the solution to which was urgent. Churchill wanted to immediately take two steps forward. The first, of course, was the founding of that Council of Europe and its embryonic European Parliament, of which he became a member. The second was the establishment of the European Court of Human Rights, the kind of independent court that he believed could have stopped the pre-war authoritarians in their tracks. And in the succeeding years, against all the odds, both came to pass. As Churchill hoped and expected, this was just the beginning of an organic process of growth. Since the Hague Congress of Europe, in the spectacularly short period of just 70 years, something astonishing has been achieved. Something my grandparents, growing up among the ruins of Amsterdam, would never have imagined or hoped for. We have enjoyed 70 years of peace, the longest period in Europe since the Antonini emperors of Rome. The achievements of constitutional democracy, science, and the arts have brought prosperity beyond imagination. The European Union is the second largest economy in the world and the second largest democracy in the world, and it is, above all, a bastion of the rule of humane laws. Now, this is the world that I was born into in 1992, the year of the Treaty of Maastricht, the year of the founding of what we now know as the European Union. This is the world my generation has always taken for granted, like the air we breathe and the dikes which protect us. And this is our blessing as well as our challenge. We do not know the horrors of war. We do not know the fear of the policeman's knock on the door. We do not know what it is to wait for hours to cross an imaginary line on the face of our continent that we call home. We do not know what it's like to have to climb and break down a monstrous wall simply to be reunited with our parents, our brothers, our sisters. Had we been born a century earlier, we would have been the lost generation. Instead, through no merit of our own, we became what Europeans know as the Erasmus Generation, after the EU's exchange program, which has enriched and empowered millions of young people across our continent. And just as it seemed it could hardly get better, just as it seemed we had arrived at that bright, tiny dot of light marked on Churchill's dark horizon, just as it seemed we would forever bask in it, all over Europe, the forces of misguided nationalism, isolationism, xenophobia, and even anti-Semitism are rearing their despicable heads again. Growing stronger by the day and manifesting themselves ever more brazenly against their common natural enemy, the antidote they must destroy in order to spread their doom again. It's called the European Union. And this time, it's the gathering storm of nationalism in the Anglo-Saxon world that is setting a dangerous precedent for Europe's would-be autocrats. From Orban in Hungary to Kaczynski in Poland, and from Kurz in Austria to Salvini in Italy, national populists are undermining the values on which Europe was built, rejecting the revolutionary ideal of ever closer union, and challenging the very idea of our unity. An idea the origin and inspiration of which I have never heard expressed more clearly than a few nights ago in a BBC documentary on the Great War. "I do not want more wars," said a British veteran of the trenches, his eyes wet, but his voice resolute. "I do not believe in them." The survival of the European project ultimately turns on one simple question, and it is a question that Winston Churchill asked in 1947. Here it is. Is the only lesson from history to be that mankind is unteachable? I propose that we answer this question, and I propose we say no. President John F. Kennedy said that Churchill, by his art as a historian, had made the past the servant of the future, and I propose we all do the same. The European Union, which history has handed us, the unfinished product of Churchill's campaign 70 years ago, is not without imperfections. But its faults are just that, imperfections on the face of virtue. The European Union represents an ideal of high hope, which is in danger, and it requires everything that all of us can give it, Europeans and Americans alike. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. The past can light our uncertain steps on a new and uncharted path. We can write our next chapter with material from the filing cabinet of our common history. We know where the dangers lie. We know what to avoid. We know what not to do. We must battle complacency. We must fight democratic backsliding, whether it's in Warsaw or in Washington, as fiercely and as decisively as we can. If we were able to build a single market that works together, we can create one that works for all. If we were able to pool our most valuable natural resources, then together we can protect them from depletion. And we must make our voice heard in defense of the European Union, which in its hour of danger seems more precious than ever before. Action this day. Thank you. Thank you. I believe there's some time left, so if you have any questions. 20 minutes. I'm sorry. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. No, you're first.
I better say I'm a Brit, and you speak very powerfully, and you talk as if you're speaking for Churchill. And I would like to say that, of course, Churchill always said that Britain will always choose the open sea. And that, I believe, is what he really thought. He wanted Europe to unite, indeed, so there were no more internecine wars between Germany and France. And the European Union was a very good solution to that problem. However, the euro has created enormous divisions within Europe because Germany has prospered and the southern European states have suffered considerable deprivation and lack of growth for their economies. I won't make a speech, I'll just ask you a question. Do you think that Europe can move forward to a united Europe, ever closer union, or do you think the project will fail?
Thank you so much. Could I just first respond to two things that you mentioned in your remarks, in your preface? One is that, yes, indeed, Winston Churchill said that we would always choose the open sea. And he said that in a terrible row with General de Gaulle in 1944, which was obviously a logical thing to say at that point. I don't think that that's, as a sort of catchphrase, I don't think that that's a fair representation of what he thought Britain's role in Europe should be. It's very complicated. I mentioned one of his quotes from 1930 when he said, "We will be with Europe, but not of it," which I think was a powerful statement of his intent, having a federated Europe with Britain as a sort of sponsor. But then, of course, the war came, and it indelibly created a need for union, and it changed the world. The Soviet threat threaten Europe, and Churchill saw Britain as a major power that would actually have to be in Europe in whichever way it could be in order to get the Soviets out. He also knew, and this was one of the characteristics, I think, of all of his thinking, that Britain would need to find a different way to amplify its power in the future if it was going to lose its empire and commonwealth. Yes, he was an imperialist, but yes, he was able to look into the future. So I think as a sort of insurance policy, right after the war, he started to consider the European Union as something that the British should be a member of. He wrote it in several letters, he said it in several speeches. I'm starting where you started because I think it's crucial to answer your preface. Second, yes, you're right that the euro has created difference in Europe and that that's bad, put very bluntly. And third, your question. Can the European project survive? Will it become this ever closer union or will it fall apart? I think we now have politicians in Europe that carry with them some of the ideals and the high hopes for what the project is in Angela Merkel and in Emmanuel Macron. And I think the pictures of them together celebrating, or rather thinking of the armistice 100 years ago, speak to that effort to recreate Europe. I think their ambition and their talent will ultimately bring us closer together, but we have to make honest choices. And I think the fundamental problem of Europe is that it hasn't made any really fundamental choices. We've tried to have it all. As a country, I think in the world you can have three things: economic integration, so wealth; democracy, parliamentary sovereignty; and the nation state. But you can't have all three. You have to choose two. I think Europe needs to choose for democracy, real grip, and economic integration, wealth. And I think the 19th century invention of the nation state will have to play a more humble role in the world of tomorrow.
Well, that's a great segue to my question, which is how does the European Union deal with forces imposing cultural homogenization and also the impact of migration, especially upon countries that are small? I'm talking about Czech Republic, Hungary. What are your thoughts on those powerful influences on individual nations? And by the way, nationalism, if you look it up in a dictionary, is not necessarily a bad thing. Hungary would like to stay Hungary and not be culturally absorbed in some kind of homogenized form, and the same is true with the Czech Republic, both of whom I think have taken no migrants and are very concerned about the issue of migrations.
Thank you. I think that's totally right. I think nation states, or at least regional communities or people that have something binding them together, want to maintain their identities. And that's exactly what the European Union can offer to them. I would never be for a kind of European Union that imposes cultural homogeneity, and I don't think that the European Union does that or tries to do that in any way at this point. I think one of the most powerful expressions to make that very concrete is that in the European Parliament, everyone speaks their own language. You still come to the table not speaking English or French, but speaking Hungarian or any other language. I think what you are seeing, and you touched on this with the migration issue, is that a lot of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe don't have any experience of taking in people from wildly different cultures. And this is posing a huge problem, which I think the Western European countries should have some understanding for, just because that history doesn't allow them to take upon that very kindly. So I think all of this requires some measure of patience. But again, I think, as Winston Churchill said, that European sovereignty is the only real protection of our diverse and distinctive customs, which would otherwise be blotted out forever. Paraphrasing.
Felix, first of all, thank you for your erudite comments, and your passion remains, as it was last year, still very vibrant. I have a question, perhaps. And I will preface it by saying you state you can't have all three things. First of all, I don't agree with you.
Okay.
I've spent my life wanting 4 things. I'll settle for 3. Second question is, and the more fundamental question, is you have a rise of populism, nationalism across Europe. You see fractures, and you have seen dramas in Spain, Portugal, and Greece. I ask you then, are these a result of trying to enforce an unnatural union? And it's trying to put a quart of water in a pint pot? For one could easily argue it is.
Thank you. Yes, I would argue that in some of the nations that have seen a rise of populism and nationalism, that part of the reason of that would be that the European Union has imposed far too many laws on them. I think Britain is a prime example, where a wish for parliamentary sovereignty ultimately trumped the wish for European cooperation. I think there's one fact of life in the 21st century that the European Union is an answer to, and it's that the great questions of our time can only be answered by larger power blocks and not individual nations. Climate change, migration, terrorism. We can all effectively combat them if we have the sort of power that the United States has. But in fact, we are just tiny nations swimming in a sea that, of complete incompetence if we don't actually come together. So yes, I think the European project itself has harnessed populism and nationalism, and we have to remain open to that problem. But I think the solution ultimately is in more cooperation and not more isolation. More specifically, your question about why not have all of those things, try to have 4 and maybe settle for 3. This sort of interlinks with my earlier answer, is that the reason I don't think you can have the full nation state if you have those other 2 things is that the nation state sort of comes in the way of that effective response to those challenges, right? If we want to make climate policy together, basically by levying, for instance, a CO2 tax on a European scale, then we have to give Brussels the power to do it. If we go do it on a national scale, we won't meet the problem. This is why I think you have to leave one out. If, like Britain, you want the nation state and national democracy, then you have to accept that that choice also means that you're going to have less wealth. Because geography really does matter, and trade that Britain does with the rest of the world is focused on Europe and not on India and not on Brazil.
What is the advantage of being in the European Union, and why does Britain want to get out of it? There must be a lot of minuses.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the big minuses, I think, is that it threatens parliamentary sovereignty. And I think Justice Kennedy remarked on this last night. And there's a huge tension there, right? Because Churchill's advocating for this great independent judicial body in Europe, which has to protect the European nations from ever fighting again. For 500 years, we had ripped each other apart in basically what was a fratricidal war. So the solution that Churchill and others like him came up with is to integrate those nations so that you will never fight again. That's the big advantage. The British are now saying, okay, well, we feel at least uneasy about that because it means that our great tradition of parliamentary sovereignty is compromised, and it is. And I think Europeans and the European Union has to be very honest about that. There is an advantage to Britain of being a part of the European Union, and I hope that my generation will at some point bring about that Britain will rejoin the European Union. And it is that British power is amplified through Europe, right? I mean, cooperating with other European nations will give Britain a chance to fight Russia in a big global conflict that is cyber war. Having your power amplified through Europe also means that you can protect your own shores, which climate change is a thing that I like to talk about, and Britain has to deal with as well. It brings enormous wealth. Economic integration has lifted wealth in Europe to levels that we've never seen before. And I think one of the consequences of Brexit will be that people will be poorer, and it's mostly poor people that will be much poorer than the rich. Not only, but not only, no. No, I'm not saying that they voted to get out. I'm saying that they will be less off. Yeah.
Countries are all individual, but what does this union do for them? Is it the trade? They get free trade?
One of the things that the European Union does is trade. So the European Commission signs trade deals with the rest of the world, which makes sure that we're a big bargaining bloc, right? So if the United States seeks to do a trade deal, it will not look to the Netherlands with 17 million people and a small domestic market. It will look to the European Union as a whole. Now, we can set the standards working together so that we don't get hormone beef and chlorine chickens into our market, which obviously the Americans would want to sell to us. So that's the kind of advantage that we get.
Thank you for your elegant summary.
Thank you.
And your premise, with which I agree. I believe it was Churchill that said the biggest problem with democracy is 5 minutes with the average voter. So, not to be Pollyannish about this, but how do you propose solving this dilemma in the age of the internet and social media, when one prime minister at least said, the average person's view of history is breakfast at CNN?
Mm-hmm. This is a huge problem, and I think there's no easy solution to it. But the long-term solution is always in education. I think our education systems have to adapt to a new way of getting information, right? I mean, I'm of a generation where basically all I've known is getting information through Twitter and Facebook. But I've also learned to deal with it because in my high school we had specific classes assigned to picking out information that was correct and information that was clearly linked to a conspiracy theory. So this sounds maybe small to a big problem, but I think the long-term solution is in education.
Thank you for this very, educational. I mean, this brings so much clarity for me. I wanted to ask about the culture of the disparate countries, and to me to Americans, we have Alabama, we have Massachusetts. Those are two different countries, in a way, culturally, you know? Is that just such a foreign concept that they can't see themselves as a Hungarian European? You know, like I see myself as a Kansan who's an American.
Yeah. That's certainly how Churchill viewed himself. He would often say, I am a European. And I think those identities are complementary, but it's not always felt. And I don't think that we have to enforce it. I mean, the American project obviously is unique, but the European project could follow a trajectory that sort of looks like it. It will take much longer because the nation states have a very complicated history of their own and of fighting each other. But it's definitely possible that at some point we'll have a similar system, for instance, in taxation. So now when you pay $1 in tax in Connecticut, you'll probably get 60 cents back. If you live in Louisiana, you put $1 in, you get $2.20 back because you have a system of distribution, because you have a unified tax system. That's not something the Europeans have, right? So once you get to see those types of transformations, I think people will also feel more connected to each other. Now, there's a powerful argument that runs the other way, that says, don't think in systems and try to make something that doesn't exist. Instead, apply what you already know and run with it. And I think that second way of thinking is what Churchill saw. And he would always refer to the European project as this sort of ember that needed to turn into a big fire. He was growing a plant, he would always say. So you started with the Council of Europe, you started with the European Court of Human Rights, and that would grow into something that looked a lot like, and that's why he called it that way, the United States of Europe. So I think going step by step will also mean that people will feel more European if Europe does more for them.
Hey, we have one last question over here.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll put you on the spot. Would Churchill have agreed to throw the British pound into the European Union financial system and basically disposed of the British banking system as part of the other agreement that other countries made. So I want a specific answer, not only when it was first formed, but today, because I thought that was a prelude of having England say, yes, I want this, but I'm not going to do this. Secondly, to this gentleman's question about the advantages and disadvantages, we were in England at the time of the vote, and what we heard over there was the distrust and bureaucracy of the Brussels European Union, lack of sense of connectivity to the interests of the countries, and so you established a gigantic bureaucracy at a high cost, which was imposing rules and regulations arbitrarily and sometimes disadvantaging countries and nations in a way that were viewed by the local populace as being setting rules for people trying to hunt, for example, and things of that nature. So two-part question. Would he put the pound into the European financial system today? And secondly, would you agree with the comments about the
Bureaucracy.
oversight of Brussels?
Thank you. The first answer is going to be boring. Never draw Churchill too overtly into a modern political debate, because he wouldn't have known, right? As Boris Johnson wrote and then quickly forgot, the oracle is dumb. He can't hear you anymore, and he's a thing of the past. So let's not abuse him for modern political gain. I would say that you can always speculate about sort of general principles, and I think John Bew did this in a great way yesterday, talking about what Churchill would have made of today's world. I think there's one guiding principle that you have to keep in mind. Churchill was always fighting for British power, right? So if he had made the calculation that the euro would give Britain more power in the world, he would have plunged Britain into it. If he had made the calculation that it did not, then he wouldn't. I'll let you make your own conclusion there. Second question about bureaucracy. First, maybe we should sort of untangle some of the myths around bureaucracy in Europe. The bureaucracy of Brussels is about the size of a mid-sized Dutch town. The European, everything that it spends is about 1% of European GDP, right? So the European Union is a very small, nimble, and actually very effective bureaucracy and a very effective type of government. This is important because people think that it's some sort of huge bureaucracy. Where I think you're right, and this goes to the core of the problem, is that there's not enough democratic control in Europe, right? You have a European Parliament which doesn't have the power to actually control income and what goes out in the European budget. That's crazy. The European Parliament doesn't have the power to initiate legislation. The executive does. That is insane, right? So if you're going to have a European democratic system, then the European Parliament needs to be much more powerful. And then you need to make an honest choice. Do you want that? Do you want a truly democratic European Parliament with actual control? Or do you want nation states with smaller democracies with parliamentary sovereignty? Some nation states will say, we want our own. And other states will say, actually, we appreciate Europe enough in order to transfer more power there so that we can have control through our own constituencies. I think that's a fundamental question that's underlying all of that. Now, I want to make one more point, because you said in a sort of ridiculing way that European bureaucracy is thinking about rules about hunting and maybe vacuums and teapots and all of those things that Boris Johnson threw into the world as a way of saying that Europe was bad. Maybe the core of what Europe is a rules-based system of depoliticizing the major questions. We've done it through growing a market. So the fundamental principle of our market is that I, as a Dutchman, can sell anything in Poland and can sell anything in Britain and anything in Germany and anything in Denmark. But in order to be able to do so, you need to have the same rules in all of those places, which is what you have in the United States as well. If you want to sell something from New York to Florida, the same rules apply. So that's everything that the Commission does. It's making rules. And they're not thinking of it themselves. National states are thinking of them. Lobbyists that want to make something and then sell it at a level playing field come up with these rules. So I think it's very important to keep in mind where this is all coming from, and this is where history comes in, because it's an important way of explaining it. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take our first break of the morning, and the next session will begin at 10 o'clock.